Meetings between world leaders, new scientific discoveries explained by experts, wars, peace treaties, trade agreements, all of these we can see in terms of when, where, and how they occurred. But it's more of a case of looking at how the patterns in these events are occurring to see how the structure of the age is changing. And one thing we notice is more people becoming able to see what is happening. I'm only here to explain how its formal structure is evolving, because every event's impossible to describe. The big question is still over the UN Security Council, which is allowing the deep divides in geopolitics to carry on. That is, the superpowers, US, UK, France, Russia and China, which were appointed at the end of World War II as permanent members with the privilege of being able to act autonomously, left only the nuclear bomb to keep the peace globally. Many wars around the world have been the result, and hence it's not only affecting the current state of geopolitics at any given moment, but also the whole timescale for global progress, to the point where a number of nations are lobbying the UN for reform. After World War II, it was a good enough system in relation to what we had previously, and we avoided World War III, which justified that course of action. But now the world has changed, and we have completely almost passed through the postmodern age. So this implies change to the world system. However, it seems that there is a bigger problem with this than meets the eye, as, for example, there were 10 years after the Cold War ended and people were celebrating this, but when the problem of terrorism arose from the structure of the postmodern age, people found out that the Cold War was not the full story of the postmodern age itself. While NATO expanded and the former Eastern Bloc of communist nations became BRICS, nothing could be done about the big picture because of the way events had happened previously. The two sides remained fundamentally polarized, although in a more conscious way, each claiming to have its own rational argument. Whereas in the Cold War, it was all about the ideological differences and making sweeping statements with great speeches. Now it is about arguments backed up with facts and evidence. But both sides still have a massive influence on the Middle East, and which is divided between the revolutionary Iran and the conservative Saudi Arabia, and fake news and state-controlled propaganda are still making the headlines. So are the superpowers still the solution to the problem? It seems that their giant, lumbering political systems have simply moved too slowly to address the issue of the structure of the age itself. How could they, though, when the locus of control is ultimately the UN? And why would they? Because the current situation gives them exclusive rights and privileges, which the US uses to maintain its constitutional freedom, the UK uses to keep the monarchy, France uses to stop people believing the French Revolution did not achieve enough, Russia uses to defend its actions while it was a Soviet Union, and China uses to justify the global need for its political ideology. During this phase, in particular, we can note the relationship between the communist and capitalist countries since the end of the Cold War has become redefined as the BRICS alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, but this has also involved backing revolutionary Iran and socialist governments around the world. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which formed after World War II as a defensive alliance against the spread of communism, especially into Eastern Europe, then went on to replace democratically elected socialist regimes with leaders who were more aligned with the West. Of course, the Cold War became embedded in the power struggle between themselves, but now they're struggling to get out of it because as a new political multipolar environment has emerged in world affairs, the difference is now that people can go on the internet and do business globally, whereas at the start of the Cold War, everything was very local, there was no internet, the high street dominated sales, and there were just not enough connections between people on both sides. Since I made the last video, which covered the war in Ukraine, I've decided that people really should know as much as they can about the full story, because a lot of people were surprised when the problem of terrorism emerged and didn't really understand it as being a product of the postmodern age and saw the Cold War as the end of the whole problem when it wasn't. And well, now we have this recent attack on Palestine, on Israel by Palestine, and by Palestine on Israel. accusations of Russian involvement implies an attack on the new centre ground, which we're trying to create, which it means everyone really has got to be involved in creating a solution to this, because of the polarization of the superpowers happens in its own way. So then it obviously comes back into the centre ground to resolve whatever issue happens at the time, and that's when everybody gets involved, and then it repolarizes again and everyone gets kicked out of the process again. When it happened October the 7th, it just appeared to be the latest episode, as Russia's claim about the Ukraine war was that it was just responding to territorial gains made by NATO after the Cold War had ended, but to everyone else it just looked like the two sides have once again polarized enough to cause a war, which then put pressure on the centre ground, disrupted Israel-Palestine relations. But now there have been inescapable accusations that Russia was even involved in the attack. Now, while I try to stay objective on describing the point of view of both sides of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, I'm seeing this conflict very much in terms of the ongoing problem of terrorism and the reaction to it from within the world system, as Israel has now been accused of human rights violations as invading Gaza. This will no doubt lead to the direct rule of Israel over Palestine, at least long enough to extinguish Hamas, but this must create more support for them as well, enough to cause a protracted siege of the whole country. However, who can say the attack on an Israeli music festival and other targets were anywhere near within the bounds of international law? We must, of course, consider the agenda of terrorism as nothing that we can understand within the bounds of world politics. And if we look at the stalemate in Ukraine, perhaps it was the intention of Russia to accelerate the global agenda. It has certainly put pressure on the world system at large and taken public attention away from the war in Ukraine at the same time. This theory is supported by evidence which shows it is not only the influence of revolutionary Iran funding Islamic militant groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, but it was Russia that Hamas leaders visited before the October 7th attack, as this article in the Byline Times shows. It says, did Russia prepare Hamas for the attack on Israel? Russia's Hamas relationship is well known and documented. This is by Mark Temnicki, 27th of October 2023. Representatives of Hamas travelled to Moscow yesterday, 26th of October, to meet with Russian foreign ministers. During the visit, it is believed that the group discussed the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. This is not the first time representatives from Hamas have met with Russian officials. Last month, Hamas Politburo chief Ismail Haniyeh travelled to Russia to meet with senior figures. According to The Hill, Hamas members also likely met with Russians in September to provide a briefing on Hamas' final preparations for the upcoming attack on Israel. Hamas thanked Russian President Vladimir Putin for his position on the ongoing conflict. This cannot be seen as a coincidence. In fact, there are some reasons to suggest that Russia helped Hamas prepare for its attacks on Israel. For example, according to a report published by the Wall Street Journal, a Moscow-based crypto exchange was found to have sent millions of dollars to Hamas the day before the group's 7th of October attack. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace also found that Russia has historically armed and supported Palestinian militants. Russia has even facilitated material support to Hamas in the past. But its connections with Hamas do not end here. According to the Ukrainian Center of National Resistance, the Russian private military company Wagner helped train Hamas militants before the 7th of October attack on Israel. During the build-up, Wagner reportedly trained and transferred combat experience to the Palestinian militant group. It also found that Wagner trained Hamas fighters on how to use small unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, that drop explosive devices onto vehicles and other ground targets. Wagner allegedly provided UAVs to Hamas militants so that they could be used for the Israel attacks. It is important to note at this time that there is no evidence that Russia directly supplied weapons to this attack on Israel. Outside of the land war, it's believed that Russia has assisted Hamas through other avenues. For example, on 7th of October, Israeli government and media headlines were targeted by distributed denial-of-service attacks. According to The Hill, the hacking groups responsible for this disruption were associated with Russia. In addition, Russia led a disinformation campaign falsely stated that the weapons used during the Hamas attack were purchased on the black market from Ukraine. This was an attempt by Russia to erode international support for Ukraine, but the fabricated statement was quickly dismissed. Following the attack, Russia was notably silent. Putin has often claimed that he's a supporter of Israel and its prime minister, but the Russian leader initially failed to contact the Israelis. Eventually, when commenting on the situation, Putin said that the fundamental interests of the Palestinian people were not taken into account. Hamas officials used this to their advantage. That's from the Byline Times. So, have they thought about the world which will exist after this? Because it may be the interest of some people seeing the only solution to the problem of establishing a Palestinian state as lying in turning the Palestinians against Hamas. How is this attack on civilization in the interests of Hamas, though, in the bid for an independent Palestine? So it looks like they've been used as part of somebody else's agenda here. We already know that the terrorist agenda is not something we can understand from the point of view of the Western rules-based world order, nor anything that makes sense from the perspective of the mainstream media, politics, or traditional conventions relating to warfare, or even the relationships between nations. There are also people who see them as being just as much a legitimate part of the solution as the nations themselves, in the sense that this is the inevitable problem caused by the structure of the situation. So maybe now what we're seeing is the people whose interest it is to look at the problem is not the people who have the ability or the finances to solve the problem. So, and the world is divided maybe in this, we could say, structurally in this sense, in terms of the structure of postmodern civilization. So the question is, what happens when its agenda is picked up and used by the superpowers? All the way through the Cold War, it was the policy on both sides to use politics as a weapon against each other in terms of inciting unrest and unthrowing unfriendly governments. Then there was the Korean War and Vietnam, but as the issue of the Cold War was resolved over time, the two sides pulled back from open warfare. Yet the CIA still worked with the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and Russia has backed revolutionary Iran, which funds Islamic insurgent groups. But now it looks like the involvement of the superpowers in the terrorist groups is an issue which will inevitably arise, and people will be asking questions about what is causing the problem. Of course, most people will simply regard this as being part of the way the situation is evolving over time, and they are reassured by the media that everything's okay, and we can see, yes, on a global scale, this is the way the situation has been going, but it doesn't mean it isn't a problem which we shouldn't be looking at when the time has come. Because the issue of the structure of the age, surely this must involve looking at the UN Security Council as well, even if it is being regarded more as a back office operation to solve problems which are unresolvable and the political process cannot address. Even though the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has said the world is not heading in the right direction, we're still not really questioning the way that the G7 and the G20 meetings have been brought forward to represent everyone sitting around the same table and discussing all the issues involved, whether it's the Security Council left to operate in the background and solve any problems that may arise which we haven't accounted for. But maybe this is the result of bringing the G20 forward and the G7 forward and having to create this kind of show must go on sort of mentality in politics when the actual issue of the structure of the whole is not anywhere on the agenda. So what we seem to be doing now is we seem to be finding the need maybe to accelerate the global agenda as we're heading into the Anthropocene with too many unresolved political issues. And we must see the role of the Security Council here as directly linked to the overall progression in human affairs. So what it looks to me is that the structure of the postmodern age finally needs to be discussed by global politics if people are to understand how we are heading into another new age. Even though official secrets laws exist to protect people involved in its many operations, issues related to the structure of the age itself and how the world works in general must surely be allowed if we are to evolve as a species. While many people are trying to address the issue in legal ways, many ideas are stuck in the traffic jam of information within the system. while the problem continues to exist at large, and the historical perspective is just lame as a resource if nobody knows it's there, which is why more people need to find it, share it, and start using it to solve the problems which are happening in the living present, which is why we need this shift, as we need to stop seeing the problems which are being thrown up by the world system as being the inevitable consequence of the way it works. In the next video, I'll be looking at what is being done about the situation in terms of how the philosophy of the postmodern age has developed, along with the way that events have occurred, and how this can help us to all find a position we can operate from. That is, key figures, their perspectives, and what we can see that they've said about different aspects of what is happening. In the meantime, if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel for further updates.